Hey guys, here today to get into one of my all-time favorite David Lynch films, Inland Empire. I feel like this is certainly a film that David Lynch has been building up to perhaps his entire filmography. I mean, I feel like through all of his films, he was just expressing something light and dark, and this one he just went all the way, like even more than Mulholland Drive, even. Because this is like the most raw, most intense display of anxiety I've ever seen in my life. This is most certainly David Lynch's most impactful and simultaneously confusing and rewarding film all the same because it makes the emotion that it taps into makes so much sense. It is that place of like just raw anxiety and depression, and ultimately this feeling that nothing around me makes sense anymore. And that's like a 3 hour epic, an odyssey of a lot of what the little details of this particular mood feels like. It feels like a lot of moods, guys like Miles Davis are tapping into this kind of thing. Like it feels like David Lynch is on a very similar thing. He certainly is just a modern genius, I think, for what he laid out. It most certainly feels like this is intended to be his final film, which, yeah, makes complete sense. This is like, I mean, of course, he did Twin Peaks: The Return after this, but this is certainly the last film he made. This is like an even further evolution of what he was doing in Mulholland Drive as far as just taking you something that's very, very warped. And it feels quite difficult to put all these particular pieces together, but it's really tapping into a subconscious notion that can often be hard to discuss because it's tapping into very particularly dark emotions within. And, a lot of this is just like you kind of see something for yourself here as it plays out with just all of these different actors. Laura Dern's the lead, and she's just incredible in this elaborate. This is one of her best performances ever. She just really gets into all these just intense and bizarre scenarios that just, like you can't imagine anyone else but her playing the character Nikki. I mean, it's really, really good. The quality here is just really ugly all around. It feels like there's just very grainy shots going around, and it feels very uncomfortable. And it can take a long time to get used to what's going on here, but it really ends up creating this amazing atmosphere in the end, which is just incredible. And you kind of just feel something, something you could tell was once light in this world, but now it's all dark and warped. I love that. That's kind of like a lot of this like sarcasm kind of comes with like the light of just like it was doing like a Mulholland Drive. I think David Lynch was very much into that kind of notion. And this is a film that just goes deep into abstract territory. I mean, there's just nothing that gets quite like into deep feelings the way this one does. It feels like a lot of the emotions here just still feel like they don't even or aren't even understood. They're just quite horrifying places. They're just really anxious ultimately. But those are moods that could just be very ahead of their time. It's like, really just this is a film that just feels like there's just so much that's going to be very particular and unique to the individual. I feel like the more you watch this, the more it feels like there's just something very strange about this whole thing. Like the labyrinth just feels very confusing, and the mystery is just very bizarre. You can tell that this is a film that's certainly trapping into the notion of what uncomfortable moments are like. What is it to just always feel like you're living in one giant uncomfortable moment? Yeah, certainly relate to that. It's awkward. Everything's awkward. So it just feels like this is kind of that, I guess, the hellish depth of, wow, that feels terrible ultimately, but you kind of recognize that at a certain point of coldness, and it's like, wow, but you work through that, too. But of course, this is one that really displays it in a very harsh way. It's just showing things that would usually seem quite mundane with the scenario, but it feels like all these realistic scenarios just become quite nightmarish, and then it just becomes one of those films that just ultimately feels like one of the most important films I've ever seen. It's just there's a lot of fear going on here. You feel like her presence is just really bizarre. You never know where she's going to go next. It seems like, yeah, it's just one of those films that, yeah, Laura Dern is just quite perfect. This is my favorite performance she did, perhaps. Yes, this is most certainly my favorite Laura Dern moment. I love her in Blue Velvet and anything she's in. She's wild at heart. There's just something really insane about what's being expressed here ultimately. It always feels uncomfortable the entire 3 hour run. That's what I think manages the notion of it that feels so timeless about it. And of course, the resolution of the camera is nowhere near like his other films. Of course, this is a lot grittier. I love seeing David Lynch when he's gritty, honestly. That's the best, I think. He just got more and more gritty with his entire filmography. That's what made him such a unique genius. He made something really bizarre and weird with Eraserhead, and then he just became more grounded all the way up through the 80s. In the 90s, he got slightly stranger, but still had a bit of a pop flair to it all the same. Then like the 2000s, it's just warped. He wants to take you weird. Like in other places, that's just, yeah, it's literally, it feels like another dimension. He found it certainly between Mulholland Drive and this, building up to Twin Peaks: The Return. Yeah, it's just a lot of ambience hovering around this entire film. It certainly is a very ambient experience. And it feels so surreal that you don't ever understand what's going on. The emotions it's tapping into are just really raw and personal. It's really quite speechless the way it sums up a lot of these kind of things. It's the most experimental expression. It just David Lynch being just very extremely experimental just feels great. That's David Lynch in his territory. He's meant to be an extremely experimental man and always forward thinking. And that's the way a man like him operates. And it's so awe-inspiring. A man like that David Lynch can keep it going, man. He's my favorite. Certainly my favorite. I guess the man I look up to the most as far as like a wonderful modern artist. He certainly is about the most inspiring man. He walks this incredibly. He tells his story so naturally, and they really are just kind of, looking at like broken innocence, an ultimate exploration of a man who's experienced broken innocence. He's kind of been a man who's been, facing years and years of just rejection and not being heard exactly the way, particularly the particular ways he wants to be. So that builds up a coldness of particularity of like. So throughout his films, David Lynch just got more and more raw. He says to this day, he still never did 100% what he wants to do. So this is just really ambitious, but I think there's just so much secrecy going on in this film too. Like, there's always like this foundation being built that like there's someone's keeping a secret, and that's why it feels anxious. It feels like somebody has something that's just really off kilter. Something's wrong. Like the characters might just have something of an evil force living inside of them. And it just feels like in the end, a lot of what this conveys is just like, imagine putting any kind of person next to these horrific situations. Like, in the end, she's like scattered around all these homeless people. And I think that's just kind of saying something along the lines of just like, yeah, I mean, clearly just being in that place, like you're no better than the homeless person out there in the heart spirit. Like it's an interesting foundation. Really raw a way this kind of lays out a perfectly anxious mind. Yeah. And I mean, it just really feels it's just very mysterious in its entire expressionism. I think David Lynch was just increasingly a better mysterious director as he progressed. That's what's so fascinating about him. He just got more and more experimental with being a mysterious man, and ultimately just terrifying. Terrifying and raw. That's the kind of the way this film ultimately is. And yeah, there's just nothing really. There's I have zero flaws with this film. It's kind of a perfect. I realized in time it's quite perfect. It had to grow on me. The first time I saw it, I was just like, what in the world is going on here? But as time has passed, yeah, it's quite genius. It's very psychological what it gets into, very complex in its themes. And yeah, you feel like it just kind of gets into something that continues the foundation of what Naomi Watts is doing of Mulholland Drive. It just feels like tapping into something that feels gut-wrenching. And it feels like this is a whole film that kind of feels very gut-wrenching in a sense, like in a psychological sense. It just takes you through deep emotions that you never knew you wanted to go through, but it's almost all the better having gone through it. That's the way a man like him operates with his films, and that's the notion this film particularly taps into. Again, the most experimental film he made. I mean, it's quite a horror film. That's the thing about David Lynch I think is also quite underrated. He's most certainly a horror director. And I think what he puts into this film is just intense deconstruction, and it just feels like it really is an ultimate summation of what it is to be on the blur of reality and imagination at all times. And the most haunting end of all this feeling, where there's an endless angle of none of this really makes sense, and I think the reason a film like this is so important is because these moods do exist in a person. And it's certainly not a film I think everyone will. I'm always curious. It feels like it could be a film everyone would love, because it does tap into very unique emotions. I always encourage anyone to see this film, actually, because it certainly does tap into emotions that are very honest and very true. And it certainly is genius the way that a man like David Lynch can operate and tap into these kind of emotions. It kind of further expands a lot of films like The Shining, like Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. It goes even further into just these kind of rich steps with a lot more lost humanity kind of going on to all that, and the tragedy behind all of that. I feel like David Lynch was certainly a forward-thinking foundation. I feel like The Shining. It feels like a lot of David Lynch films feel that way. They're yearning for mystery over a preference of mystery over anything. An endless sense of mystery and very surreal. And it just feels like a breeze, honestly. I mean, quite horrifying. Like, the most horrifying. But there's some moments here that are just so terrifying that it literally makes you just get goosebump. It's goosebump inducing, simply. Mulholland Drive is more of an emotional stab in the heart. This feels more like just being in a labyrinth beyond the depths of having that heart being torn apart, and it's an incredibly surreal piece. I mean, there's so many moments here that just feel so uncertain. Like, it's like you don't know what you're doing out here. Kind of in the world kind of feeling. I mean, really, David Lynch was tapping it. I can't imagine him being, I don't know if he was into like a band like Radiohead. I know he expressed not liking Bob Dylan, so I certainly could see him not liking Radiohead much. But yet, this film does kind of remind me of some of the stuff. Like Kid A, particularly. The feeling that album taps into. This is just one of those films where you're going to watch this and have to feel like, I don't know what's going on. But again, it's that anxious notion that's going on. It's just what it is to be in the hands of a character who doesn't know what's going on around them. So it's like, well, neither do you. And it's a 3 hour, it's just an examination of that particular piece. And what it is to always know that you feel that way, but you can always like find, this is certainly not being friendly to giving you those grounded moments. This is just kind of always going in. And it's just one of the greatest pieces of art David Lynch ever made. I love that man so much, and the modern foundation he's laid out, it's really timeless and really still one, lives eternally, catching up to, and still in many ways. It's just so crazy. Very shocking. And it's one of those films that, again, it's just very particular kind of moods that it taps into, and it's very raw. So I highly recommend checking it out if you're looking for the ultimate mystery thriller is the best, and horror. That's the best way to describe. Certainly one of the best horror films of all time. That's Inland Empire. Check it out.